All right. Who here, raise your hands if you could have done with an extra hour of sleep. Yeah, I think we're all there. We're doing this on hard mode, but really, really excited that we're here with Professor Andy Wu and Nina Edwards. So big round of applause for our panelists. I'll get to the intros for the panelists soon, but just so we know who's in the room, can we do a quick show of hands if you're a researcher or you're an academic? Okay. If you're working in industry, okay. If you're a startup founder, awesome. Okay. Great. Well, my name is Sudhanshu. I don't know if you guys have met John Werner, but I was his mentee when I was a freshman at MIT, and that's how I got to know him about 10 years ago. I'm now at Harvard Business School, about to finish my MBA, and I have the great fortune of being in Professor Andy Wu's class. So he's the professor of strategy and technology, he's the Arjun and Minu Melwani family associate professor of business administration at Harvard. Also joining us is Nina. Nina is the VP of Emerging Technology and Innovation at Prudential, and very excited to have both of them to share perspective, both from an industry as well as an academia perspective. So maybe to kick things off, I'll start off with a question for Nina. Can you, firstly, please add anything I may have missed on your introduction, but would love to hear, what is top of mind for you today, at Prudential when you think about Gen AI? And really the theme here is, there's a lot of demos we see on Twitter. The question is what's actually ready to be a real deliverable?
So I love this question. I'm not going to spend any time talking about my background. I think you did a great job. We have limited time here, so I want to get into kind of the good stuff. When I think about Gen AI and Prudential's journey in particular, one of the things that I think was really impactful to making sure that we saw impact and we saw growth was to take a step back from all the hype and all the FOMO and really start thinking about strategy. What were going to be those use cases or those areas that were really going to activate and light up and deliver real benefits to us, a real ROI at the end of the day. So when we actually put together that Gen AI strategy, we looked across 5 tentpole use cases. 3, I want to say we spent a good amount of time on and actually have already seeing some benefit in, and that would be the code generation, code modernization space, and then also looking at our service use cases, and then finally in the content generation space. So those are the spaces that I feel like are primed for even further growth or further automation, further expansion in terms of the technology at this point from a Prudential perspective.
Interesting. And just to dig in there, why does Prudential care about code generation?
Well, I mean, we are a 150-year-old company. We turned 150 in February. So when you think about code generation, code modernization, the heart of that is going to be these companies that have been around for a long time, have a lot of legacy code, and have a lot that they kind of need to clean up. And these are the things that are going to help us to advance that work a lot exponentially than it would, let's say, 5 years ago, right? So it's a core focus for us.
And how does remodernizing your code show ROI? Because a professor of mine at HBS was telling me we have some code from the 80s that HBS uses, and it does okay. Nobody wants to touch it because it's going to break. How do you think about ROI for something like code remodernization?
So I like this question as well. Very early on in the code generation and code modernization journey, we were thinking about ROI, and I think a lot of companies were thinking about ROI this way. It was sort of the same way that we had viewed ROI from a metric standpoint from projects in the past. So you would look and say, well, there was this time savings at the end of what it is that we did. And when you actually pull back the covers on that time savings, it was very fragmented time savings. So for every line of code that you got some savings on, that savings didn't come at the end. There wasn't this lump sum, every developer now has an hour or 2 hours on their day. They had 5 minutes here, they had 10 minutes here. So you have to kind of flip. And just like the technology has advanced and has kind of grown up, the way you think about ROI has to grow up a little bit too. And you have to start thinking about how did this actually help developer productivity? So how was I able to do more code than I was beforehand? Was I able to get more out of the developer in terms of, let's say, even the stopgaps when you have to do the stories, right? Like, how were you able to kind of move the needle and move things along? That ended up being a more powerful ROI story than just saying, oh, well, I had an hour that I was able to save.
So, Professor, I know you spent a lot of time talking to leaders in enterprises, advising companies. Does what you heard from Nina surprise you in any way? The top use cases we heard were code generation, customer support, and I think you mentioned a number 3 as well.
Content generation.
Content generation.
So first of all, I just want to mention that code from the 1980s you mentioned at Harvard, that's what we used to assign your grades in class.
Okay. So that explains the mistakes. Okay, got it.
Yes. Now, I think that's absolutely right. So you talk about code generation, talk about customer support. I think that is the low-hanging fruit we have to get at. But in terms of the broader transformation of the enterprise, beyond, I think, software development's the very clear opportunity. But when we're talking about legal services, we're talking about accounting, HR, training, all the other enterprise stuff, I think that is going to take a long, long time, much longer than we are thinking about in this room right now. I think the value creation of Gen AI for all those functions of the enterprise is tremendous, but I also worry that we are in a bubble right now and that this is going to take many years to actually implement. There are many frictions in an enterprise, which many of you are familiar with. I think most corporate IT systems are not well set up to bring together data to leverage generative AI tools. And second, that for most rank and file in a company, actually there is a lot of resistance and learning that has to be done to adopt AI, and I think that is going to be several years down the road.
Interesting. Well, just to
add on to that point,
please.
I think that last point that you talk about in terms of talent and making sure that you're bringing everybody along on the journey is so key and so important when it comes on to how quickly you can advance. There's always a lot, when Gen AI kind of came on the scene, there was a lot of, is my job going to go away? What is it going to look like in the next 5 years? And having that constant flow of communication and having, very targeted and specific, communication sessions with folks that are the most nervous about what it might mean for their job. We made sure that we did that in pockets. We wanted to make sure that we took advantage of all the curiosity and excitement around it, but also use those times where we were reaching out to folks within the company to dispel some fears and some myths about it. So to your point, Andy, it is going to take a while within enterprise. I don't think that this is a situation from a Gen AI perspective where people need to be worried about next year. My job is gone. And that message needed to be proliferated across the company.
So I guess a follow-up for both Professor Wu and Nina. ChatGPT came out 2 years ago. It has, I don't know, like 400 million monthly active users today. It's clearly delivering real value today. Why is it that you think the enterprise adoption of AI is going to take much, much longer? Like, why haven't those use cases been already implemented yesterday?
All those folks that raised their hand and said that they're part of industry are not going to be surprised by my answer here. We are working in highly regulated industries. It's hard to kind of jump in 10 toes down and say this is what we're doing. And
could you give us the next level of detail there? Like, how does being in insurance and regulation, like how does that impact what you can do with AI?
It means that for a lot of the, sort of smart, savvy startups that are out there that, we're very interested in what it is that they're developing, we have to make sure that the proper risks have been evaluated before we can do that. And so much of this is really new that takes a little time to say, okay, we're going to do this. You see it in content generation all the time. That has moved so quickly in terms of what you can do with the technology, but there's still things like indemnity and making sure that we're covered that we need to think about before we actually implement an enterprise and say, okay, yeah, we're going to do this now.
So when we talk about really seeing the value you're talking about is the individual value that all of us individually experience using generative AI tools. That is different than value creation at the level of the enterprise in terms of seeing action in the P&L, whether that's top line growth or cost savings. Now, I'll just highlight a couple of the challenges in translating the individual value you're seeing up to the level of the company. So first and foremost, as you brought up, I think security is a real issue in the following sense, that in the last 10 to 20 years, CTOs and CSOs have been bred in a culture of security first, and every app has to go through a rigorous security check. Well, let me tell you right now, there is no world where your company uses generative AI, where your company is more secure in the future than it is today. It is only going to be less secure. And that is going to require backing off security regimes that we have developed in the past in order to facilitate innovation using all these tools. That's slow. That is not the culture of most companies. The job of a good CTO or CSO is to say no, and your job as a CEO is to say maybe. That's one example. But then at the level of the individual people, look, frankly, most people in a company don't use generative AI tools. At best, they're using like maybe Copilot like once a week. But the actual diffusion in a company for most companies is very, very low. You guys are the early adopters here. Now, I just want to offer a comment about exactly what the resistance is from the employees. So the most common thing I hear from CEOs in terms of how they perceive their employee resistance is, hey, they're scared of losing their job. I think that is intuitively right, but it's the wrong side of the same coin. So the way I've learned actually that the real resistance comes from the following, that from the employee perspective, the worst thing in this world is not losing your job. The worst thing in this world is that you're going to give me more work and not pay me more money for it. That's the real resistance.
Interesting.
Okay. I'm curious, I guess in this room, like how many people, show of hands, will say at work, Gen AI is making a real difference on a day-to-day basis? Like I'm curious. Okay, wow. So I guess in an individual level, we are seeing people in the enterprise using stuff. So maybe any sense on where that disconnect might be between clearly there's impact Gen AI is having in the enterprise?
So when we've looked at surveys of when employees save time with generative AI tools, what do they do with that saved time? Now, a lot of that saved time goes to yourself. So you end up, spending more time with your family or whatever. That isn't directly value necessarily for the P&L of an enterprise. The other dimension, what's interesting is that with the Gen AI tools, we're accustomed to spending a certain amount of time on certain kinds of projects. So what ends up happening actually is that people will overexert themselves on the same project without, taking on more and more projects, right? Now, I think that the value that you're seeing is real. I totally buy into that. Has that translated into actual cost savings or revenue growth for your company? That's the step we have to take to when we talk about enterprise value creation.
So I agree. I do think that's correct. But I do see some non-monetary value in happier employees.
Yep.
So folks that are now getting more time to spend with their families, folks that are able to complete work that was draining and took them a lot more time to do, and able to kind of, breathe and have a sigh of relief, like, okay, I have this sort of super duper analyst on my side called Gen AI helping me through things, it's a plus for the company at the end of the day. Did it translate to P&L? Okay, not yet, but I think this takes time. So Andy, back to your point earlier, we're still, I would say, in the early stages, and that part of getting folks comfortable with it and seeing the value is incredibly important to get to that point where you're seeing the P&L value. You want people to become power users of it. You want them to feel as comfortable using it at home you want them to get as comfortable using it within the office as they do at home when they are doing, ChatGPT from their phone. It needs to become commonplace and just part of that rhythm.
Yeah. So let's say, you're a CIO, CEO, you've gone through this prioritization exercise, volume of tasks, expected impact, technical complexity, you've mapped them all out, code gen, customer support, content creation's bubbled up to the top, and let's say you now have the sign-off, like we want to go do Gen AI on these categories. I guess, Nina, from your experience, again, being in industry, being in Prudential, once you have the sign-off, what do you think are the biggest bottlenecks to actual deployment? And I think we heard privacy, data security is one. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, are there others? And if you could share, where in that journey are you from? Mm-hmm. I think you clearly have the top initiatives identified. Do you actually have anything deployed? And are you seeing real ROI yet?
So it's a good question, and I would say that the answer is different for each area or for each template use case that we kind of looked at. We're seeing definitely ROI for the code generation, code modernization piece that I talked about earlier.
And if you could share with us, what kind of ROI?
It's what I was talking about before. So
As in, is it 10%, 30%, 100%?
Now, I'm not sharing any hard numbers here, but
And exciting enough for you to keep investing.
Exactly. It is exciting enough for us to keep going. It's, again, points to the developers are actually happy to be using this. I know a few that I've spoken to that were just like, I can't let go of this. Like, I'm so happy that I have it. The speed at which I can work now is great. So again, it's about that velocity that they now have in their jobs that we're really seeing the ROI at the end of the day versus, again, that whole fragmented time savings discussion that I was alluding to beforehand. For the content generation piece, we have spent a lot of time there as well, particularly within our marketing area, and we're already seeing benefits there. And it's along the same lines of that velocity piece. We can, do some automated blog postings and automated social media postings a lot faster, using Gen AI than what we were doing beforehand, right? So everything right now is really around that sort of efficiency piece internally for us. And now we're looking to kind of scale further. So we started with a, sort of proof of concept and then like a small pilot within our US space. And now we're scaling that, out globally. So a lot of good stuff coming in terms of our Gen AI usage at this point. And people are just super excited. And that is what I am the happiest about.
And just to double click there, how did you think about what you should be building in-house as Prudential, and where were you looking to partner? And of course, nobody's trying to build a foundation model competing with OpenAI, but even if we were to think about the app layer, do you think the APIs are simple enough for you to glue together and build your product? Or in which cases are you actually looking for external partners and vendors?
So this is a hot debate. So I'm glad you asked this question. It's a hot debate just generally, I think, for most folks, but then also internally to Prudential. And I think the same sort of lens that we've taken in the past in terms of what makes sense to look externally with versus doing something internal is sort of the same here. You're going to look at what is the bread and butter of your business and what you want to be known for, your strategic capability. And those are the things that you're going to kind of keep close to the chest and say, we need to have some control over it. So we need to start thinking about what we can do internally to develop this sort of technology. That's not absent saying, okay, we might have an external party that we partner with there, but part and parcel when we think about that piece of it, it's going to kind of rest with us. And for some of those commoditized workflows and more utility workflows, that's where we're going to look to partner. So this is like document summarization and things like that. We're not looking to be known to be the best document consolidation company in the business. So that's where we would look to have help externally and say, this is where we need to kind of investigate and do some real diligence on companies that can help us with these sorts of problems.
Professor, in class, you often talk about judo strategy, right? That a startup can use, especially for the folks in the audience, you're founders, you want to build something that a Prudential would use, but then you have, the Microsofts of the world knocking on their door saying, hey, click a button and use our product. Or, you have the system integrators of the world saying, hey, no, we're AI experts. So what advice would you give to a founder in this room on, how do you crack a Prudential? Where do you differentiate?
Absolutely. So we use judo strategy as a metaphor for competition between a smaller business and a larger business. And the idea is, historically in judo wrestling, there were no weight classes. So in theory, a small person could fight a big person and win. And so I think there's two key areas where the smaller enterprise can beat the larger enterprise, right? So I think the first is in terms of the opportunity for the tech entrepreneurs here. Really, I think the most straightforward opportunity is selling consulting services, where you can call it a Palantir model if you want, to help companies like Prudential implement various technologies. And the idea here is actually there are not necessarily good economies of scale in a consulting model. So actually, as a result, it's fairly easy to undercut Accenture on price and then do the same thing at a lower price point. That's one opportunity. I think the other opportunity actually is that the organizational transformation for a lot of traditional enterprises going into the Gen AI era is going to be difficult. And so the idea is that you could just be in that industry as a one-person competitor and play. So for instance, I think the application of generative AI to legal services is very, very clear. And for a variety of reasons, your big white shoe law firms are going to have a lot of difficulty adjusting to all the possibilities of Gen AI. What you should do as a new law school grad, when you graduate is to just start your own law firm, use all the Gen AI tools, and get the same performance as Wachtell on your own. And then you can play against Wachtell with like a much lower cost structure.
Just to dig into the first point, like, do you really think a 2-person team who is now trying to be a consulting company goes to Prudential and says, we will undercut whoever your current consulting partner is? Like, will they be taken seriously? Like, couldn't anyone just do AI implementation, and is cost really the main decider on who they pick?
Not necessarily Prudential, but like, for instance, around this country and every country, there are a ton of small and medium-sized, let's call them family businesses. Any company in the headcount range of like 50 to 500 employees cannot really afford Accenture, right? So they've got to find some sort of technology partner to work with them on implementing both AI tools as well as the IT infrastructure necessary for those AI tools. Really what they need is actually like a solo entrepreneur to come and work with them to do it. Like, can't really afford the $1 million Accenture thing.
I wouldn't disagree with that. So I want to say small and medium-sized businesses make up a huge chunk of the economy. So there is definitely a huge opportunity there. The point of Prudential.
So don't build for Nina.
No, I didn't say that. I mean, but
it's a longer sales cycle.
It is a longer sales cycle. And again, it points to a lot of the things that we were talking about before. It is not as easy for a large, well-established company to jump into business with a startup that hasn't had a whole bunch of customers or experience, specifically within large enterprise, where you do deal with a lot more complexity in terms of like the legacy sort of data, things that could potentially still be on mainframe, but that you're really going to have to contend with there. So it's a longer sales cycle. There's a lot more diligence that has to be done, but I wouldn't say that it is 100% impossible, right? We have, smart startups that we talk to all the time, and sometimes maybe it's a longer sales cycle, but that you pivot in terms of what you're actually doing with them. Maybe there's something that we work on together so that you have the power of enterprise working with you to develop that product so that it does become ready for enterprise. So it's about not staying stuck on, well, I just need you to buy it and sign on and do this for me, but thinking more broadly about what that relationship really could look like with enterprise. It shouldn't always be about the sale.
So again, just for the benefit of folks in this room, let's say someone says, listen, I really want to solve a problem for Nina. Mm-hmm. I want to be a startup that cracks. Prudential is my first or second customer. Like, what are some top of mind pain points where you haven't found a good Gen AI tool in the market? Now, CodeGen, like, we have my friend from Codium in the room. Customer support, like, there are a dozen other companies doing it. Like, what is something that is top of mind, but you haven't found something where you're like, you know what, I'm ready to hit buy? Okay,
and I think this will resonate with a lot of folks in the room. When I think about really sort of painful, like complex workflow processes, so what comes top of mind for me is really on the procurement side. So when I think about a solution, or really even jump into the agentic AI conversation, it's about how, agentic AI can kind of help those large, complex workflows that have multi-decision points. For me, yes. I have worked outside of, just working at Prudential. I have worked with Accenture. I've worked for a lot of large investment banks, and I have not met a company whose procurement process I could walk away with and say, that was swift and so easy. I can't wait. Like, I'm going to stay here just for the procurement process. It was so easy. So kind of tackling those sorts of things, or that in particular, would be great. That's one of many that I can kind of think of.
Professor Eddie, you're hearing about, or one to throw out into the audience.
And I'll speak about the SMB target market, right? And so you should picture like a 250 person like law firm, or a 250 person insurance brokerage, or something like that. The number one thing is enterprise search. So what these executives want is like to be able to have some sort of chat bot where they can search quickly through their HR data, combined with their CRM data, combined with the ERP data. That would be the dream for every one of these companies. That is the number one thing I hear. But I want to have us make sure we keep in mind exactly what the product is. Look, the front end UI and the model, you don't have to do any of that. The product they really want is for you to help them integrate the API from the CRM and the ERP and the HR database together. So in that sense, it's actually much more of a consulting project than like you're building some app company, but that would be real value. That is what the executives immediately want and what they're asking for now.
Okay. I want to get one question from the audience. We have 4 minutes left. Anyone with a question that they'd like to ask either Professor Andy or Nina? Yes, question at the back there. Yeah.
I'm actually I've been seeing on your last comment regarding the true price curve. See, may solve that problem.
And the question is, has anyone solved enterprise search well?
I'm also interested in this answer.
I have not seen it, but if I can just speak to why I think that is, it is because fundamentally the typical enterprise has data scattered across different applications, different functions, different geographies, and actually the company's like intrinsic infrastructure is not well set up to actually be searched through any typical RAG thing. So it's not a problem with the application, it's a problem with the company structure itself, which is why I think that our race to adopt applications in the enterprise is actually not the right strategy. What you want to go fastest on is the thing you go slowest on. And the slowest thing is actually integrating all these systems together.
Yeah.
We have a couple of minutes left. So it sounds like there's real use cases, real value, but then Professor, in the beginning of this conversation, you said we're in a bubble. So what do you really mean by that?
I say we're in a bubble. By the way, everything you're going to hear today about the grand vision for AI, I 100% believe. I am very much optimist on that. However, I think we are getting ahead of ourselves here and that this is going to be a longer journey than we think. There's a couple of fundamental challenges. One of those is adoption, which we've talked about a lot. I think the enterprise rollout is going to be slow. There's also a fundamental problem with the unit economics of generative AI companies, which is that the variable cost of this technology is way, way above zero. That is not how we typically think about software. And then as a result, a lot of the traditional business models we have, I think, don't actually make sense. And what I would anticipate here is that we need to make a transition. In your younger days, you used to pay Microsoft for a CD, and then you'd be able to use that software to your heart's delight. And then we made a transition to the subscription business model. And by the way, let's not forget how annoying and painful that was. And by the way, it took us 10 years to make that transition. My prediction is that after this, we're going to have to make a transition to the usage-based business model from subscription in order to make this unit economics work. However, customers are not actually used to that business model. So we're going to get a resistance for a period of years, but eventually when we get there, I think it'll work. But yeah, we need the business model to change. We need the variable cost to come down. But otherwise, we are in a period right now where the variable costs are above the revenue coming in.
That's what our VC friends in the audience are for.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm totally okay if you want to lose money on fixed costs. I am not okay if you want to lose money on variable costs, right? R&D is great, but losing money every time you acquire a customer is not the pathway to success.
So we have a minute left. I'd love to ask each of you, if someone in the audience finds you later today, what should they come talk to you about? Nina?
Good question. If I am answering that question within the vein of Gen AI or agentic AI, I would like for folks to come and chat with me about ideas that they have that are specific to enterprise and the problems that they're looking to solve. So part of my role is definitely to look at strategy and also strategic partnerships. So for all of the startups there with big ideas, I love that. So I would love to kind of sit and talk. And you know this from last night. I love to talk about those big ideas.
Professor?
So contradicting everything we've just talked about, I think that actually there's too much attention on generative AI for productivity in the workplace. I think the biggest impact of generative AI is going to be our lives outside of work in terms of our consumption experiences. You can picture social media and video gaming. And to that extent, I'm very excited about like the metaverse opportunities of generative AI. But of course, if you want to ask me about the workplace, that's fine too, whatever.
Awesome. All right,
Yeah,
with
I'm
that,
on the clock, so I got to talk about work.
awesome. We're at the end of our panel, guys. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you. A round of applause for